we had the good fortune of finding one of the members, Alfred, playing guitar by the side of the road as he was there selling mice. They get their name from the fact that they sell mice on a shish kebab to passing travelers as snacks. And in the downtime, which there's a lot of downtime because there aren't that many people passing by to begin with, they play music. And what we found when he played for us was just incredible.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hello, rock stars. It's your host, Lij Shaw. I created this show to introduce you to real-world recording professionals to hear their stories and learn from their experiences so that you can take your records to the next level and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Ian Brennan, a recording artist, producer, concert promoter, activist, and author. He is a Grammy-winning producer with 4 Grammy-nominated records for Best World Music and Best Traditional Folk. Ian has many interesting tales to tell, whether performing a weekly show in a San Francisco laundromat for 5 straight years, or producing records in the recording studio, or promoting concerts for crowds of thousands, or traveling the world recording some of the most fascinating music you might hear. Ian is always creating, recording, and writing about it, and as a result, has an intimate understanding of music. He has written a fascinating book called How Music Dies or Lives, that shares his deep understanding of music, culture, and recording. He helps us look beyond what the world recognizes as music through popular recordings and into the core of what music really means to us as human beings. It is an ear-opening journey around the world with the intent of preventing us from deftly stumbling toward the end of music through innocent global homogenization of culture, by guiding us to a better understanding of what music really sounds like when it matters the most. Ian has had a long career of recording his own music and producing others' music, both in the studio and outside of the studio. His client list is loaded with names that you might recognize, like Kip Malone and Tunde Adebimbe from TV on the Radio, Flea, Lucinda Williams, David Hidalgo of Los Lobos, Nels Cline of Wilco, DJ Bonebreak and John Doe from X and the Knitters, Bill Frisell, the Dirty Dozen Brass Band, Jonathan Richman, Richard Thompson, and many more. But it's the names that you wouldn't necessarily recognize that tell a truly remarkable story of Ian's recording career. Projects from around the world like the Malawi Mouse Boys, the Samba Prison Project, Hanoi Masters, and Italy's Canzoniere Grecconico Salentino are recordings that Ian passionately writes about in his new book. I'm extremely honored to have Ian with us today on the podcast. Please welcome Ian Brennan to Recording Studio Rockstars. Ian, are you ready to rock?
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome,
Thank you.
Man. I hope you don't mind my long-winded intro there.
No, it was flattering. It was nice. Thank you. Thank you for that.
So tell us in your own words more about who you are and how you got into music and recording.
Well, I mean, I think myself, like a lot of people, caught the music bug very early, meaning as long back as I can remember, about 5 years of age. I started playing drums and guitar, and I didn't imagine ever doing anything else with my life, and was terrified that I would have to do something else with my life. And so I became very obsessive with guitar as a teenager, like a lot of people do, and it was kind of my life raft to survive the trials and tribulations of adolescence. And as it turned out, you know, as it is for most of us, it's not that easy to make a living music. So playing music, so I had to find another way, and I ended up working in psychiatric facilities, and the two worlds kind of, you know, interweaved and became parallel in terms of doing social work and music, and as I see it, music is largely social work anyway.
Now, I credit you as being an activist. That was sort of my interpretation of some of the awareness programs that you've been involved in. Do you think that's accurate to describe you that way?
Well, again, I mean, it's very, I'm honored to be described in that way. I think that's probably more for other people to decide, but certainly I've been involved in, you know, social work in a very literal way, working in facilities in mental health for 15 years and teaching violence prevention training for 23 years. And then, you know, in a more active way, so to speak, doing a lot of benefits. And that's how I kind of got into producing other artists, was through the production of big not big, but multi-band benefits that would raise $1,000 here or $5,000 there for causes such as for the homeless and other political issues that were going on in San Francisco at the time.
Well, cool, Ian. One of the things we like to do on the podcast is ask you to start us off with an inspirational quote. Is there something you'd like to share with us to get us going?
Well, there's probably many, but one that stays with me a lot in terms of recording is to turn up the mistakes. Don't try to hide them. Just bring them right out there in the open, and they stop being mistakes at that point. And similarly with live music, to keep playing the mistake just until it becomes a pattern, and maybe you find some new way of expression.
I've heard that talked about in the jazz world a lot. Sometimes you hit a note and you're only about a half step away from the note you might want to be on at best.
Yep. And I think sometimes those end up being whole new worlds. That's probably where the blue note came from. It's probably an accident.
Yeah, indeed. Well, speaking of quotes, I've written down quite a number from your book. I mean, the book is just packed with great concepts and great ideas and just great insights into music, what it's all about, what recording's all about. And so I'm going to probably share some of those back with you here in a moment. But before we get to that, can you share with us sort of a story? You've accomplished a great deal in your recording career at this point, and it's nice for our listeners, who I like to refer to as the rock stars for the show, to understand and humanize kind of your path and your journey. Can you share with us a story for you about an important failure along the way, something that became a real learning experience for you?
Well, I think, really all the early records that I produced were failures, and they were failures in that I was trying to do things the quote unquote right way. And this is back in the late 80s, kind of, where multi-track recording had developed into a very defined craft, and everything was very prescribed in terms of equipment and how you were supposed to do things, what was better than, what medium was better than others. And, I look back on that in my life, and I hope that all the things I did wrong helped me maybe to help artists get out of their own way now. But certainly I look back on it also tinged a bit with regret, knowing that when I did my first record, I had the choice of doing it in the right studio that had slightly better equipment that I could afford, or doing it with a guy who didn't have that good of equipment, but was an amazing producer and artist. And I made the wrong choice. So I went with the slightly better equipment, and ended up with not only having a very antagonistic experience with the engineer there, but also just the album is awful. It's horrible. And I blame no one but myself.
I'm sorry, this is one of your own records, or this is a record you were producing? Yeah,
it was the first. It was my debut record back in 1987, and I produced it, and it's just a disaster. And it didn't need to be. It probably wouldn't have been great either way, but if I had, there was that crossroads, and if I'd gone left and rather than right, certainly it would have been much better than it was.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it seems like we need to go through that process to arrive at a real understanding of what we want to do creatively and musically.
Yeah, I think we have to choose to believe that, and it's probably true. It's probably true as well.
I think it was Picasso that said something like, it took me years and years to learn how to paint like an expert, but a lifetime to learn how to paint like a child again.
Right. Yeah, learning to forget.
So share with us now a story of a moment of success for you, something where your recording career really came together.
Well, I'll tell you one, in that segue kind of from live production and live performance and promotion into recording, because the division between where one ended and one began has still never really been defined, because I continue to help sometimes artists that I produce with live stuff. But I'll tell you one from the live world was I was working with Merle Haggard quite a bit back just after the turn of the millennium. And I did a show with him, a benefit with him, and it sold out. And it was at the height of his more recent comeback on Anti Records. And, his promoter, who'd been his promoter, or his agent, I should say, had been his agent for forever from Nashville, called me the next day and said, I don't know what you did, but you are the only agent ever in like 30 years of working with Merle that he's ever not complained about, and he's ever liked, and he wants to do more shows with you. And
Wow.
and I had no intention of ever doing any more shows, not so much with him, just with anybody, because it wasn't really what I wanted to do. But as a result of that, I did end up doing, a series of shows with him over those years, like 6 or 7 shows out in the West. But I, that was a nice one. And I only think of it because of his passing here in the past, couple of weeks.
Yeah, really. Have you ever had a sense that, the extent of your understanding of things, being a performer, being a producer, being an engineer, being an author, being a concert promoter, they've all been symbiotic and helped you make better records in the end, or promote better concerts because you understood the recording process?
You hope so. You hope that these things do synergize and somehow complement each other. And I think often we tend to be better at the thing that we care about less, because we're able to be more objective and divorce ourselves from our ego more. Mm-hmm. And certainly for me, with the live performances and also with the quote unquote difficult artists, I started being fed a lot of these artists that record labels and agents felt were difficult back around that same time, around 2000, 2001, and from then on. And people kind of learned of my background or knew of my background, and so they felt like I could deal with people that had addiction problems or maybe mental health problems, and so having worked in the psychiatric world, it made it kind of easy, because usually what people consider an emergency in a live music setting is not. I mean, sometimes there's some horrible, mm-hmm. tragic things that happen. We know that. We read about them on online or hear about them. But in general, running out of beer is not an emergency, right. or somebody being upset because they don't like their seats is not life and death compared to somebody who's trying to off themselves or is going after somebody with really aggressive intention.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, even the replacements trashing the green room or the blue room at the show is not really truly an emergency.
No, in fact, it's probably a good thing in hindsight.
Well, so people were sending you these challenging artists to work with because of your experience in psychiatry and working with conflict management and all that. What are some of the benefits of your experience in that area, working with people that do bring conflict to the musical process or the recording process? One of the quotes from your book, I don't know that I wrote it down, but you said something along the lines of, if everybody's happy when you're recording or making music, something is terribly amiss.
Yeah. Yep. I definitely think that's the case. If everyone's happy, then you've hit some kind of compromise medium that lacks point of view. And I think that, people oftentimes will say, well, a producer is supposed to be objective. And well, that's ridiculous. Producers aren't objective, but hopefully they are more objective and provide a different viewpoint than the artist. That's the hope. And obviously we know bad producers are not that way. They might have a bigger ego than the artists themselves. And I feel like the task is to help people to be the best they can be, which really just means being as honest as they can be, not fearing, not letting fear get in the way, and trusting themselves enough to reveal themselves and also to experiment. And in mental health, a big thing often is to try to decipher what someone is saying. It might mm-hmm. be somebody who's floridly psychotic, but there's meaning there, and all behavior is motivated, and trying to get to the core of what that may be, which may be buried under layers of negativity and maybe even downright frightening behavior. But it doesn't mean that there's not a certain internal logic. And I think, that focusing process is hopefully what you're trying to bring to a project. Is not polish, but just helping to really focus the message and the narrative and the emotion so that it's clear, in a way that's more universal.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to bring a quote back to you here. This is a quote from your book, How Music Dies or Lives, which is in parentheses. I didn't specify that. Far too many prefer to masquerade as someone else rather than accepting themselves as is. artists don't need a gimmick. Instead, they just need to simply not disown whatever makes them novel and to celebrate it instead, which I think is incredibly insightful. It's what you're talking about, but would you like to clarify that some more?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think that you see it sometimes with artists that are fortunate enough to persevere, or fortunate enough to be given second or third or fourth chances, that they, when they finally surrender to who they truly are, then they're embraced. And obviously prior to that, there's it's conceptual. They have a concept of what makes them attractive or doesn't make them attractive, or what would make people like them. And I think with bands, that's oftentimes they're trying to play for some imaginary audience that doesn't exist, rather than trying to just connect with one single person and communicate very directly. And we see it, I think, a lot with actors, that as they age, a lot of times these serious actors become, really good comedians when they stop trying to be glamorous and they just start trying to instead communicate. I mean, I think, you see that with Alec Baldwin, you see that with Vince Vaughn as examples, even with a great actress like Meryl Streep, you see someone who, became good at comedy, and was a great dramatic individual. But because, again, I think that their ego, hopefully, not that it's not big, but they are able to maybe, disengage from it in a way where there's greater freedom.
Does William Shatner get to participate in that party, or was he sort of funny at the start?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a different thing, and I think it's not bad either. But I think that's the person who was being ironic without meaning to be ironic, and then is given the benefit of later claiming that the whole time they were in on the joke. And I think that's a pop cultural phenomenon that we see a lot now. Nice. But you have to give the person credit for, at some point, finally, kind of accepting that maybe they're not as cool as they thought, and getting in on the joke.
He's definitely cool now.
Yeah, and rich.
So, Ian, tell us, you as an artist yourself, a songwriter, somebody who's gone through the process of finding their own voice, and you've taken a lot of wrong turns. Do you feel like you could have avoided those wrong turns that you took, or could you have sort of accepted your own voice from initially at the get-go, or do you feel like you had to explore these other things and come back from it?
I mean, that's a big question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to that, but I think in general, it becomes a question of, was I emotionally capable? Certainly I could have, and I blame nobody but myself. And I still to this day do wish that I would have, that would be nice. But I think that, you have to embrace your own experience. And so I'm happy. I'm happy to be alive. I'm happy to be given another day every day, and hopefully we'll continue to learn. I think that's the key. If we continue to learn, then there's a reason for continuing and being here and doing what we're doing. And if we don't, we're kind of just filling space.
Yeah. Well, so now also in hindsight, what are some of the suggestions that you would make to somebody, as a producer? How do you help guide somebody towards knowing that they're using their own voice, or staying in that? Like, what does it mean to have your own voice?
Well, I mean, I think that it's fine to have influence, but it's fairly consumeristic and can be somewhat indulgent, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But I think for a lot of artists, it's good to purge themselves and maybe to abstain from listening deliberately to recorded music, and to try to listen instead to things that are more random. I mean, there's no silence. There's no such thing as silence. So what, the sound that they're surrounded by. So that's one aspect. And then I think also that it's oftentimes good for people maybe to go to the other extreme and really to embrace something in an obsessive compulsive way. Something that might really move them. It might be a single song or a single performance. That's kind of an ancient traditional music technique sometimes, is, to literally play the same song until you drop, for days at a time, and to often have it sung into your mouth by a master, or have it beaten into your chest or back by a master, the rhythm. So that's kind of the other extreme where and again, I think that's a case of learning to forget, where it becomes so deeply embedded that you're able to then move on to the level of expert, which is, novice is where you consciously have to think what to do, and that expert level is where it's all forgotten. It's still there, but there's a freedom to maneuver over and above kind of the steps that are normally necessary. You see that with great athletes as well, where they're not thinking about what they're doing. They're just able sometimes to get into the zone, as they say, and do things that no one could ever consciously produce.
Yeah, it's that process of learning it so that you know it so well and then forget everything you learned.
Yep.
So now, Ian, one of the quotes from your book, too, I think is an interesting concept of how a producer might perhaps guide somebody towards finding their original voice. And the quote was, "The best direction to give any performer is, quote, play badly and have fun." Talk about that a little bit and what that means to getting a great performance in the studio or out.
Well, I think that people need to have energy when they play, and they need to hopefully be not anxious. Anxiety doesn't generally, produce good things, and there's a belief in our society that pressure is good, to be perfect, and the pressure to be the best, and I think oftentimes that's false. It causes people to become paralyzed. That's the nature of fear, is paralysis. And so, again, people are very obsessed with often with the end product, and yet it's oftentimes only evident to them, and you see that sometimes with individuals where they'll become obsessed with one note and they want to redo one note, and either that note is really cool by accident, or in a lot of cases, only they are ever going to notice that note even exists, and good bands, if they're ready, they'll come in and you can do 20 takes of a song, but really, in most cases, the differences are very slim. Mm-hmm. And if they're dramatically different, then there's something wrong, meaning, probably it was at the end of a session or beginning of a session, and probably it should have been tried another day rather than 20 times in a row.
Do you ever have a sense on a session that it's less about your ability to identify one note as being better than another, and more about your understanding of the energy and the emotion going on in the performer in the room, and it just feels like it was good to do a second take, or it feels like let's move away from this and stop trying to fix stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about momentum. I really believe in the idea of frequent and brief. I believe in frequent breaks. And again, a lot of that comes from my own errors. I was so obsessed with quantity over quality. When I was a teenager, I would play guitar every hour I could play guitar, which meant, when I was in school, I would play, 5-6 hours after school until I fell asleep with the guitar in my hand. In the summer, I would play literally, 8 to 14 hours a day, locked in my room. It was counterproductive, and so now I believe quite in the opposite, which is, don't ever record for more than maybe 4.5, 5 hours, because beyond that, people start really getting fried. And better, again, if you're going to do 20 takes of a song, do it over 20 days or 10 days rather than 20 in a row.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is a lot to be gained. I know you talk about not wanting people to be under a sense of stress, but there's a lot to be gained from urgency of the moment. Like, this is it, go for it, Yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, people need focus and they need direction, but I mean, there's that ancient proverb of a job expands to the time allotted for it, and I think that's true in most cases. I mean, some things you can't build, a skyscraper in 8 hours if that's all you're given, but with so many tasks, and this is why deadlines can be so good, with so many tasks,
you get them done with whatever amount of time you have. And if you have too much time, you oftentimes get less done, ironically, or paradoxically. So, I'm a big believer in momentum and just trying to play and stay in the right brain. I think people spend a lot too much time in their left brain and being analytical and to switch back and forth like that in a creative endeavor can be really, really, again, paralyzing.
Yeah, I think that's Parkinson's Law is the idea that any task will expand to fit the time allotted for it.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
So if you just leave yourself a day to do it, it's going to take a day to record it, and if you do it, and hopefully you got to leave at least 3.5 minutes if it's a 3.5 minute song. I don't think you can record it any faster than that.
Not yet. They're working on that, though, in Silicon Valley.
All right. So here's another quote from your book. And this one is about the studio and how it interacts with everything. You said, technology often acts mostly as an enabler to procrastination, feeding the fear of commitment. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think it becomes the cart before the horse. And we see that more and more as people strive for perfection. And, people might arm themselves with the right equipment. I mean, that was probably more of a concern, in the pre-digital era where people were really concerned about what hardware they had, having the right guitar amp and the right this and the right that. And, something I learned in playing live, and I'm sure other people have made the same observation, was, when you're touring and when you're meeting different bands, maybe 3 bands or 4 bands on a bill, pretty much the more drum equipment somebody had, the worse the drummer they were. And if somebody came in and they had like a little kick drum and a snare and a hi-hat and one crash, you knew that they were going to be awesome, because they kind of had to be. And again, I mean, these are not hard and fast rules. Neil Peart's awesome, but he spawned a lot of imitators that thought that was, thought that was the path or the key to success was to, buy as many pieces as they could, as opposed to just learning to play. Right.
The idea that I've got this one drum here and I could probably make it sound a whole lot better if I add another one right next to it.
Yep. Exactly.
All right. So maybe I have to apologize in advance, but I'm just going to keep throwing quotes at you. So here's another one, a great one from your book. And you said, over conceptualization can be bad. It can keep people trapped in their head and interfere with their objectivity. For growth to occur during any creative process, the result has to be different than originally envisioned, which I think is brilliant. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if the end result is exactly what we envisioned it to be, then in most cases there wasn't much point in doing it. And what I've found in general is that most of the things that we envision do come to pass, but they oftentimes come to pass differently and almost always on a different timeline than we expected. And so I think having ideas and concepts and trying to follow those is a great thing. But I think there's that balance, and the balance is, being able to adapt and to use what you're given or to use what's there whenever possible.
Okay, so this is a perfect segue into the next quote. And I'm going to preface it by talking about how I see this a lot with bands in the studio. Band comes in and they're prepared and they know what their song sounds like in the rehearsal space, and they know what it sounds and feels like when they've been working out the different parts. And sometimes I see that becoming an obstacle for moving forward in the studio. And it kind of clicked with me one day that the studio, of course, it's different when the band comes in to track it, because this is a whole new instrument. Just miking up a band in a recording studio is an entirely new instrument that they're using to play the song that they believe they're very familiar with. And so the quote from your book is, I believe, from your live performances, but I think it applies to the studio and everything, which is when you said that when performing, you have to use the noises in the room as your accompaniment, which I thought was very cool. Can you elaborate more on that and what that means to, just getting the best performance of a song in any environment?
Well, I mean, I think you literally, like you said yourself, you have to tune yourself to the room. It's a different instrument, and I think musicians that are very exceptional, they're rare, but those very exceptional individuals definitely pick up on resonances and frequencies that we're just incapable of even noticing, and that's part of what makes them so special and who they are. But yeah, for me, because I did the live shows in the laundromat that were free for so many years in a neighborhood where there were quite a few homeless people, and it was a very dynamic environment with people doing their laundry in a cafe and coffee being made. I literally had to learn how to make those sounds part of a solo acoustic performance, and to try to time yourself to the room and almost anticipate noises that were going to happen before they happen, and incorporate them rhythmically somehow or sonically.
Well, and I think the simplest analogy that everybody listening to this is going to understand is the train beat. The train rhythm on the snare. It's the song written to the sound of the wheels going over the tracks and over the train ties.
Yep.
And then, so let's see, I've got a couple more quotes, but I'm really dying to get into some stories of your recordings out around the world. I mean, I'm hoping you'll share some of those with us. In fact, maybe we'll just jump to that. One of the ideas of tuning your music to the environment is something that I witnessed when I saw the band Hun Her playing a performance in New York. And they were asked, so this is a Tuvan throat singing band that was quite well known in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. And they were on tour here. They were asked where the origin of the music may have come from, the wind in the plains and also the sound of running water. And so they actually played running water, and one of the artists stood there and did a throat singing that perfectly blended with the sound of the recorded water, which I thought was really cool. And
right.
One of the things I noticed in your bio is that you've had some experience recording Tuvan throat singing, and I'm a huge fan of that, and I'd love for you to tell us some stories about that.
Well, I was fortunate enough to do a record with Sanko Namchilak, who is the leading female throat singer in the world. And most of her career has been devoted to avant-garde singing and records, a lot of a cappella singing. And she's virtuosic. She has a 5-octave range, but we were able to do a record. It just came out earlier this year, where she collaborated with the rhythm section from Tinariwan. So we brought together these two nomadic traditions, and it was more song oriented, and it was instant composition. For the most part, she brought a few songs and they reinterpreted them on the spot, and otherwise they wrote songs on the spot. And we recorded a double album literally in 5.5 hours in one afternoon. And,
wow.
We didn't release all of it. We released a single album, but that's quite long. Some of the songs most of them are pretty epic. They're 6, 7, 8-minute songs. But that type of singer gives new meaning to what it is to be a vocalist. Somebody who not only has that range, but somebody who has a range in terms of tone, where they can literally sound like other people and even like other species, like you said, mirroring the sounds of the environment, the water or the wind or whatever other noises they might be exposed to.
Yeah. So let's just dig right into some of the geeky tech stuff too, because our listeners love that, and so do I. How do you go about even recording an artist like that? Tell us about the way you mic'd up a session like that.
Well, I mean, for me, as often I try to keep it as simple as possible. I'm not a tech guy. I'm not an engineer. I've just been doing it for so long that I have a modicum of ability that allows me to do it. And when I can, whenever possible, I love to have a great engineer, with me, and to do the recording. But because of the field recording, especially, I had no choice but to be the one to do it. And so I'm a big believer in good mics and great singers are going to equal something good. Just put the mic close to them and keep the level as high as you can without distorting. And if you can, put it through a good preamp of some sort. With the mobile recording, I've got some battery operated sound devices, preamps that are good. And then otherwise, I don't believe in EQing things. I believe in letting the sound speak for itself.
Okay, interesting. Let's before we get away from it, can you name drop a couple of cool battery operated recording devices in case anybody's looking to get into that themselves?
Well, I mean, Tascam, is kind of the origin of home recording, and they still make some nice products. Zoom makes some really good products now as well, as far as the recording devices themselves. The sound devices is about the only really good high end. It's quite expensive, single channel preamp. To have one or two of those for vocals and maybe for an acoustic guitar can help bring the sound up another notch. But again, as good a mics as you can get that aren't going to require, a phantom power, yes, but aren't going to require a box of some sort and aren't going to have problems as you travel to different environments with different, circuits is good, So, but in the end, oftentimes the differences are fairly negligible between a super fancy studio and recording outdoors.
Okay, so that's fascinating because as you're traveling around the world, obviously you can't always just plug your interface into the wall, your typical laptop and interface and, 3-prong outlet. So a lot of the times this gets solved by just having battery operated equipment.
Yeah, it's all battery operated. And that can be very liberating as well because your reach literally is not limited by, an extension cord or power strip or whatever it may be. And I actually do prefer and almost always choose to, whenever possible, to record outdoors. When that is possible. The one big thing outdoors is wind, and so if it's windy, that's about the only thing that's insurmountable. We're mixing a record this week that we did, and we literally did it in a school that was surrounded by 3 construction sites. One of them on the school grounds, one of them over the fence, and the other one over the other fence. And none of that is on the record,
Wow. That's fascinating to me because I have a good friend here, Roger Mutno, who's produced a lot of records that I really admire. And he built his studio near a train track. And he told me once, he said the same thing. He said, I've never heard a train on one of our recordings. It goes amazing. By all the time and you just never hear it. Something about it's musical or it just blends right in. So talk more about how the construction site didn't somehow destroy your recording.
Yeah, I mean, there's still the fear that it would. I mean, I've been in this situation often, really. You don't realize, I think we're able to filter out so much of our environment automatically, unconsciously. And when you begin to record, suddenly you become conscious of these things. But then in the end, I found time and again that so many of those noises that are obvious are not the problem. And then there are other things that maybe aren't, that maybe are a problem. But this was, particularly daunting because there were 3 constructions going on at the same time on 3 different sides of the recording. It turned out fine, but I think it can give you a heart attack if you're there, witnessing it,
And probably not the kind of place you want to have a heart attack either.
Yeah, I mean, those kind of situations can be very maddening, but in fact, often they're just fine, and there's a great relief that they are. Again, the sounds that tend to present the most problems are wind and transient sounds. Yeah. Really loud transient sounds can be very difficult to eliminate or mask or edit out. But otherwise, with proximity, when the mics are close, when somebody's performing, oftentimes that's all you really hear, and anything else just becomes a part of it somehow.
What about when you're using battery recording devices? Do you tend to also get a much cleaner sound? You don't have the low potential hum of your power source. Does it just tend to be a cleaner sound, or is that a pretty subtle difference?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the situation, but in general, it does eliminate some of the complications. Obviously, it presents other ones, in terms of the need to change the batteries regularly, the occasional situation where you might, lose something if you're not on top of it, but that's rare. But I do think that you certainly, particularly with international recording, it eliminates a lot of the concerns with what's going to work where.
Yeah. Okay, so next question, microphones. Talk to us about some of the real workhorse microphones that are great for taking out into faraway places.
Well, I've got quite a few. Old mentor of mine told me a long time ago that you can make a whole record with SM57s and 58s, and I really believe that's true.
And you can build the studio by hammering the nails with them, right?
Yep, it's incredible, and in fact, I've as time has gone on, I have more and more mics that are expensive mics that can work out in the field, like the Browner Phantom and things of that sort, and they're great, they're awesome. But depending on, again, the mood or the feel of the performer, I oftentimes will just give them a 58 and tape it up around the mic cord to make sure that it doesn't detach, and let them do their thing, because again, it gives them a freedom. If it's somebody that can't hold still anyway, or somebody that's intimidated by a large diaphragm microphone, then I think that whatever you're sacrificing is going to be well worth it.
I don't know where I wrote my quote down, but you also made a comment about that. You said something about bring the recording to the artist, don't make them come to you when you're recording them. That sounds like what you're talking about when, if the big microphone is intimidating, go with the other one.
Yeah. Sometimes a lot of this stuff is counterintuitive. And for me, part of the learning process oftentimes is remembering or relearning something that you've forgotten or forgotten the importance of. And so all these ideas, I find myself sometimes breaking them, and falling back on patterns. But I try to be sensitive to that. I mean, there was a situation once where I was a more introverted individual who liked to play seated and was very shy and kept moving away from the microphones. And it was like I was pushing him across the room. And it took me many feet of that, it was a relatively big room, to realize what I was doing. I mean, I was literally pushing him around and not being sensitive to what his experience was, because I was trying to get the mic close to him. Yeah. And in the end, it's like, well, let's just record it at the distance he would like, and it's not optimal, but again, whatever we're losing sonically, we're probably gaining in terms of that there even is a recording.
Yeah, really,
and that hopefully the recording feels better, emotionally. And
performance still trumps sonics.
It does, absolutely. I mean, I think most people, their music collection, the range of quality sonically is so vast and wide, and the one unifying aspect is that they like the way the recording makes them feel. Yeah. It's never, I never mean to at all, dismiss the importance of sonics. I'm revere people that are good at it, and certainly a Pink Floyd record or a Steely Dan album, things of that nature are incredible, or a Queen album. And I know I'm incapable of being able to even do that. So it's not that I resent that type of recording. I think it's awesome. But those oftentimes sit side by side with somebody who's got an MP3 of Louie Louie, and it's because of the feeling that they're united.
Yeah, well, if it makes you feel any better, I'm pretty sure that Pink Floyd and Queen and those guys probably couldn't recreate the same record again anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is true.
So another thought, and then we'll move on, is, you talked about the counterintuitive nature of choosing different microphones. I remember the first time I had an SM57, and I thought it was the greatest sounding mic I'd ever had a chance to use and hear. I mean, it sounds incredibly good. And, so sometimes we forget that as we move on to the next thing and the next thing. And then we look back and think, oh, that first mic we started with, that must not be any good because it was the first one I started with, when in fact, it might be a brilliant mic to use.
Right, right. Exactly. What's shiny and new is not necessarily better.
Okay, so in a bit here, we'll take a break and come in for the jam session at the end. But I'd really love to hear some more stories from you about these incredible journeys you've been on and recording. Tell us about the sessions with the Malawi Mouse Boys, because these are some amazing sounding recordings, really beautiful voices and mysterious rhythmic stuff and guitar tunings going on. Very cool stuff.
Well, they build their own instruments, and the Malawi Mouse Boys have been singing together since they were small children in their village, and they live without electricity and without radio, without television, without running water. And music is a part of their daily lives, and they literally learn to sing together. So they never have really sung apart. And I think when you stumble upon that, it's any microphone that's within 6 feet of them is going to capture something potentially cool. And the ability, the depth of the musicality is so profound because they're not viewing it in a consumeristic way. They're viewing it in a very natural way. They don't feel that it's in limited supply. And one of the most incredible things about their group is the ability, I wouldn't use the word improvise, but the ability to adapt instantly. So if they feel like it, one of them might switch and sing lead on another one's song without ever having done it before and without planning it and without rehearsing it. And if you listen to it, you would never know that person had not written the song and had not been the lead singer all along. So I think that performers like that make the job of recording very easy, because there's such an abundance. Now,
how did you find these guys? Tell the story about your travels. I believe you said that you and your wife traveled together a lot doing these recordings and going to these places around the world. Maybe you notice I'm hesitating to say field recordings because I remember that was sort of a point you made in the book too about whether you called them field recordings or something else. Maybe you can talk about that too.
Yeah, I think that all recording is field recording, and the best recordings come from a place. And more when you listen to something, you have no idea where it comes from. Whether it comes from a studio in London or whether it's recorded in somebody's bedroom in Indonesia. It's hard to decipher the difference, and I don't think that that's necessarily a positive. I think that can really be a negative. I do prefer to record outdoors, as I mentioned before. And my wife and I, Marilena Deli, she does all the video and photos for the projects. And we've really made a concerted effort to try to find music in countries that are underrepresented, to try to make some small contribution to tip the scales of distribution more fairly. It's minuscule. In the USA last year, they estimated over 100,000 releases. Yet most countries in the world didn't have a single release internationally of popular music. So it's a very, very small contribution. We seek it out. And with the Malawi Mouse Boys, the Malawi is now the #1 poorest country in the world. One of the big issues there are instruments, and they make their own instruments, but instruments are still very scarce there. And so we had the good fortune of finding one of the members, Alfred, playing guitar by the side of the road as he was there selling mice, because they get their name from the fact that they sell mice on a shish kebab to passing travelers as snacks. And in the downtime, which there's a lot of downtime because there aren't that many people passing by to begin with, they play music and they practice, so to speak. And luckily we saw him there. Otherwise, we never would have found him. And what we found when he played for us was just incredible. The song and the singing and even the first song he played was incredible. But then to think that there were more people in his group and that there were more songs ahead was almost more than we could hope for.
That's wild. How were the mice?
I'm vegetarian, so I have the perfect excuse. I have the perfect out. The sugar cane I can tell you all about, and it's great. The mice, I don't know. Though other people have told me that those that are willing tell me that they like it, and of course they say the cliche, which is that it tastes like chicken.
Right, which tastes like frog, which tastes
Yeah.
like who knows what. So, you talk about the underrepresentation of this music from around the world, and the overrepresentation of pop music. Without you even telling me which one you're thinking of, I can tell you the beat probably goes boops 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 boops. There's it's just the four on the floor has sort of impregnated all of pop music these days, it seems like at times. But you had a hilarious story in your book of going into a record label, and I wondered if you could talk about that. It sounds like you came back with some of the recordings and you went to one of the bigger labels in LA, perhaps. Maybe we don't mention the names to protect the innocent, but would you like to tell us that story?
Sure. I mean, we went to South Sudan 1 year after it was formed, and a lot of people don't realize that that's a country. It's not a region of Sudan. It's a separate nation, very different nation that fought for their independence for 50 years. And so 1 year after independence, while they were still actively at war, we went there seeking music because, who could be less represented than the newest nation in the world? And we had the good fortune of meeting quite a few groups while we were there and recording them, and a few different records have come out of that. But one of them was the Wayao record, which was a tribe that plays a 10-foot xylophone that requires 5 people to play the xylophone because it's so big. And it's considered the heart of the village. You can't move it. So it sits there in the middle of the village, and it's central rhythmically to the life of the people there. And essentially everybody in the village can or is involved in the music making, either through dancing or singing or participating in some other way. So, it was a beautiful, amazing experience to record with them. And it's very hypnotic music and true dance music. And so, in everyday life, talking to musicians or people I knew, I shared the story with quite a few people, and without fail, people were very enthusiastic and very interested in that story and found it, to be a interesting, positive thing. So fast forward, about 5 months or whatever, and I was in LA, and I was at one of the biggest record labels in the world and one of the most powerful executives in the world. And this is not a place that I normally am, but I was there. And over the course of a very short meeting, this trip came up of the recording the 10-foot xylophone, and I told it to him with enthusiasm, thinking that this was someone who loved music and would find the story exciting. I had no delusion that he would have any interest in putting that music out, but I thought as a music lover, he might find a 10-foot xylophone that requires 5+ people to play it, at least something, of interest. And basically, before the story was done, he took a phone call and I got bounced out of the building. So
it's funny because I've been there and I've done that before, where I've been in a record exec's office, with the CD of this band I produced. And it's such a humbling experience to have them pop the CD in, and they listen to half of the first song, and they maybe skip to the next one, and then they hit the stop and they begin to explain why they're not going to sign the band. Yes.
So it's a reality check.
Maybe he just realized that touring with the 10-foot xylophone just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, I wish that it were. I wish that it were that defensible or pragmatic, but I think it's just in those cases, apples and oranges.
So I want to ask you now about the Samba Prison Project, and I also would like you to tell us a little bit more about the tech side, maybe some of the microphones you used to record that, and I noticed in your final product, you talked about not using EQ to record or to mix rather, but I'm thinking maybe you do have a good handle on compression and limiting and sort of making sure that the final version of the music has a controlled dynamics range so that it will play back on a iPhone or whatever system we're listening on.
Yeah, I mean, Samba Prison Project, we went into the maximum security prison for Malawi, and we worked for almost 2 weeks with the men and women there on songwriting and on recording. We recorded over 6 hours worth of music, which is a lot because it involves 60 people, and most songs were recorded just once. And from that, we released a record, and much to everyone's shock and surprise and pleasure, it received a Grammy nomination at the end of 2015, and that became a big story internationally. It was reported by the BBC and Associated Press and CNN and on and on and on. So it was a very positive and interesting experience. I mean, the individuals involved were aged 22 to 70, and with the men, we recorded in their little rehearsal area. They have a specialized area, and with the women, we recorded in the dirt courtyard of their area of the prison. And as far as the EQ idea, I mean, don't get me wrong. When it comes to mixing, I believe in EQing, and I believe in compression, and I believe in doing whatever you can to make it sound as good as possible. I always turn mixes over to people that are far better engineers than I, and I've had the good fortune of working with a lot of them, but in particular, David Odlum is just incredible. He's in France. He's an Irishman. He was one of the main members of the band The Frames that was Glenn Hansard's band before he went solo. He does just an incredible job. I've also had the good fortune of working with John Golden in the mastering process with records since 1987, and this individual is not as renowned in some ways as some other people, big name people from New York or wherever, but he's been mastering records for 50 years. 50 years this year. So I don't think there's anybody that's been doing it longer, and he's just incredible in that he doesn't judge sound. He just takes whatever he's given and tries to make it as good as he can, and tries to be sensitive to the vision of the artist, the engineer, and the mix engineer. And he used to do all the mastering for the Hawaiian label that would put out the individual that sings the version of Over the Rainbow, the legendary Hawaiian singer.
Who you mean.
Yeah, and he would simultaneously the same day was doing almost all the mastering for many punk and noise labels. And he would approach them with equal respect and care. And I just can't speak highly enough of him as someone who is able to bring out the best in any recording, really.
That's very cool. Tell us his name one more time.
John Golden. It's Golden Mastering. He's in Ventura, California, and he's been mastering records since 1966.
Wow. Very cool. So now, Ian, I want to ask you a little bit more about this recording outside thing, because I think that's very relevant for our listeners. Talk about the difference between recording inside a space and recording outside.
Well, I mean, I think, when you record indoors, again, you want to tune yourself to the room and use the room, and every room has color, and it can be a great room like the Columbia recording room in Manhattan, where they recorded Sketches of Spain and Simon and Garfunkel records, diverse records, but had beautiful sounds, or Sun Studios, where Mr. Phillips designed the room specifically to have more bleed and more reflection, because that's what he desired to make a recording sound live. But what I like about outdoor recording is that there is almost no reflection. There's some reflection from the ground, but there's virtually no reflection. And so I think that it can create a really pure and beautiful sound. And yet, depending on the humidity of where you are, there will be some slight differences, that again begin to reflect the place.
Okay, so now I'm actually going to segue into another one of your quotes, because it talks a little bit about this, and it talks about the nature of sounds. You in your book talked about the difference of recording a sound when it's totally dry and how that makes it intimate versus when it's back in the space, what it does to the sound. So here's the quote, because you hit a few cool topics. Quote, "There is a constant interaction between elements when recording. Things change meaning within context. For instance, a loud note is perceived as longer than a soft one, a higher frequency more loud than a low one, and the same volume through repetition appears to weaken over time, even while remaining stable. Generally, distance equals depth. Most times, rather than crowding, if you move a microphone further back from the source, its sound grows bigger." So I loved reading that stuff. Every single one of those lines, I was like, oh my God, that's brilliant. I love it,
Great.
So now, what about the very last thing? You talk about moving a microphone back and making the sound bigger. Is that a totally different experience when you're outside versus moving it back in a reverberant or in a room where you've got an enclosed space?
It's not a totally different experience, but it is different, and it depends also on the source. I mostly record, acoustic music or really, really extreme, like damaged equipment, electric or electronic music. So in general, the sound sources aren't very loud. It's usually wood instruments, not brass instruments, that sort of thing. But the same basic principle applies. That said, my goal usually is not to make a big sound. My goal is usually to make really intimate recordings, and to do that, the closer the microphone can be, particularly to the singer, the better. That you really get that sense that they're talking in your ear, that they're right there with you.
Yeah. I noticed in some of your photos, you had things like an SM7 there. I think that was the only one I could actually recognize.
Yeah.
Do you still have some favorite dynamic mics for recording with?
Well, favorites. It's just using what's there. Sometimes there might not be any choice. I mean, I think that the SM7, I think it's hard to argue with the prevalence of that in radio.
Yeah, totally.
And when you're doing this kind of recording where people are playing live, and a lot of times that might be somebody accompanying themselves. Yeah, you want to try to bleed is not a bad thing, but at the same time, if you can isolate things, particularly the vocal, that's going to be good as well. And certainly that microphone is designed to do just that.
So there was something very cool in the Malawi Mouse Boys recordings where you had something that it was almost as if there was a slap or an echo going on as part of the rhythmic elements on certain songs. Was that something that was just acoustically happening in the space? Is most of what we might hear on that record what happened in the moment? Or were there any overdubs that you did? Did you ever build any songs through an overdub process?
No overdubs. Almost none of the records have overdubs.
Okay. And there was a song on there called The Wasp, I think.
Yes.
What was that crazy sound? It sounded like a busted old megaphone or something.
Yeah, it's just, again, singing through an SM58 through a battery operated amp and cranking it up and using it like a megaphone, which is what he was inspired to do. He was laying on his back, just going crazy in the dark.
That's very cool. All right. Well, hey, we're going to take a break here in just a sec. But before we go, can you share with us a story of one of the most challenging field recordings that you've done?
Well, I mean, again, I think anytime you encounter wind, it tends to be problematic. And on a recent recording we did in Cambodia, we ended up having to record the artist inside the back of a minivan. That became the shield, where everything outside was being blown to shit, but inside it sounds pretty okay. It sounds pretty quiet.
That's great.
So, I mean, again, that's just a case of kind of make and do with what you have. Luckily, we had a minivan because we don't usually on these kind of trips. So if we'd had just a car, it would have been that much harder.
Well, and if it was just a cargo van, it might have sounded quite different from a modern minivan. I don't know.
Yep, that's true. Absolutely.
All the soft stuff. You're going to listen to it in the car. Always been curious. What does it sound like if you just record it in the car?
That's right.
All right, cool. Well, rock stars, we're going to take a break here, and then we'll come back for the jam session with our guest, Ian Brennan. And I just want to remind you that you can find all the stuff we're talking about in the show notes. Just go directly to rsrockstars.com and use the search magnifying glass to find Ian, and it'll take you right to the blog post. Or more immediately, if you're on your iPhone listening in the podcast app, you can just touch the screen where the logo is, and it should open up the show notes, which will have the direct links right there and take you straight to the webpage, and you can find out more about all this stuff. I'll make sure to include great links to the records Ian's talking about. There's a number of amazing videos on YouTube, so I'll probably have way too much for you there when you get there, but it's great stuff. So Ian, we'll take a break for a second, and we'll come right back for the jam session.
Okay, great.
Hey everybody, it's Lid Shaw, and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of Recording Studio Rockstars. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your time. And as a way of saying thank you, I've created a special mix tutorial just for you, Rockstars, totally free, called the Mix Master Bundle. With it, you get over 2 hours of detailed videos watching over my shoulder as I mix a song in my studio. Plus, I give you the free ebook that explains how I recorded the tracks. And you get downloadable multitracks so that you can practice your mixes, including the Pro Tools session file, using nothing but stock plugins in Pro Tools, all of which you would find in any other DAW, whether you're on Logic or Studio One or Reaper. Maybe you're struggling with trying to improve your mix technique, or maybe you just simply don't have access to multi-track files or can't record a full drum set in your studio. I wanted to give you a chance to create your own mixes from full drum kit, bass, and guitars recorded in my studio. The song is called American Winter, and it's off my instrumental record, Skadoosh, and it's all available for you totally free right now. All you need to do to get it is text Mix Master Bundle to 33444, and I'll send it directly to your email. Again, that's Mix Master Bundle with no space to 33444, or you can go directly to mixmasterbundle.com, enter your email, and I'll send all the files directly to you. Thanks so much, rock stars. We'll see you guys in the jam session. Cheers. Hey, rock stars, it's Lid Shaw, and we're back now with Recording Studio Rock Stars. My guest today is Ian Brennan, who's this amazing songwriter, producer, author, and we're talking a lot about his book, How Music Dies and Lives, and we're going to go into the jam session now. Ian, are you ready to jam?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool, man. Thanks for joining us too, man. Really appreciate you taking time out to do all this with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So, Ian, when you started out in recording, what was one of the things that was holding you back?
Well, I mean, I think it's always fear that holds people back, and I think rather than trying to deny fear, which is oftentimes people's goal, I think to acknowledge it and then to proceed is usually the better course. And I also, when I began, equipment was so hard to come by. I mean, this is before even the Tascam Porta Studios. So it's been brilliant to see the accessibility of recording for people, that it doesn't require that pressure to go outside their own home and to spend huge amounts of money, that they can maybe develop, more organically and build up to something bigger.
Yeah. So now, for example, for the field recordings that you do, an obvious reference would be somebody like Alan Lomax, who had to travel with all kinds of big, bulky tube tape machines and reels of analog tape and everything. I imagine that would have been pretty challenging for you out in the Sudan, in places of extreme weather. It's much easier probably to have a little digital handheld recorder.
Yeah, I mean, the digital era has made so much of this possible in a way that just otherwise would not be, and gives such a safety net. If nothing else, just the ability to back things up. When you talk about Alan Lomax, I mean, I wonder what was lost. There must have been so much great stuff that was lost.
Interesting. Yeah. That's one of the topics that you mentioned in your book. I forgot what the chapter was called, but it was sort of like, it was about capturing the moment and this idea that when we record something, it's a representation of what that music was at that time. It sort of generalizes music. So when you talk about music lost or found in the recording, it just reminds me to point out that, the music is always changing. Like, even if you capture it, there was music a minute before and a minute later that's always lost.
Yeah. And I think we can't be obsessive compulsive about it. We have to just, to be thankful for what we're given and work with what we have, because inevitably there's going to be some loss involved.
Yeah. So last point about Alan Lomax, and then we'll move to the next question. You mentioned something when you were doing the Samba prison project about rehearsing with the band beforehand. And that really caught my attention. I think sometimes we just assume that if you're out there doing a field recording of some sort, you just press record and you capture whatever somebody does. And it's really interesting to me that you really worked with people and helped them get ready for the performance and the recording. Do you feel like that's a unique approach to it?
Well, I mean, it's a luxury. In fact, most of the situations we don't have that luxury. A lot of the recordings we've done have happened in a single day, a single afternoon, meet somebody, do it, and that's that. with Samba Prison, we had a longer period to work with people and for people to write songs specifically for the record. But in the end, I don't think there's a song on the record that was tracked more than twice, and that was the exception. So what you're hearing are our first takes almost always.
Yeah. Well, it's the power of preparation, right? Getting ready for the recording.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's sort of ironic that, I work with bands here that would consider 2 weeks to make a record an absolute luxury.
Right, exactly.
Sort of funny. All right, so next question. Ian, share with us some of the best advice you received.
Well, I think some of the best advice I ever received was make sure musicians are standing up and moving when they're recording. But more specifically, I would refine that to make sure that people are doing whatever they normally do. So if they normally play guitar and sing, they should play guitar and sing and not track a guitar and then try to sing to it. And if they normally sit in a circle and face each other, then that's how they should record, and everybody's different. They've developed different patterns, maybe out of necessity, maybe they've got a cramped rehearsal space, which has caused them to have to play in a certain way. But in most cases, it's better to recreate that in the studio rather than to put them in an entirely different environment. It's already different, but to set them up in such a way that it's completely unfamiliar.
Okay, so for example, if you've grown up playing a 10-foot xylophone in the center of town, don't expect to get the same performance by handing them a Fisher-Price xylophone in the studio and ask them to play the same song.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah.
And by the way, are you standing now or are you sitting?
I am standing right now.
Me too. I like to do all my podcasts standing for that very reason.
There you go. Yeah.
So now share with us a great recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that our rock stars could use right now in the studio or outside of the studio.
Well, again, I think it comes back to the point we were just talking about, which is that to record in the manner that people are comfortable recording. Meet them where they're at. So if they're a night person, record at night. If they're a morning person, record in the morning. If they are someone who has incredible stamina and is maybe that rare individual that needs to kind of work things out of their system and is not going to be at their best till they've kind of pushed themselves to a point of exhaustion, then go there with them to that point. But in most cases, again, I really believe in frequent and brief, and I really believe in recording somewhere that has meaning to the individual so that it does have a sense of time and place, even if it's not outdoors. I'll ask artists, if we're able, obviously you can't record at the top of the Eiffel Tower usually, but to say to somebody, well, what's a place that means a lot to you? And a lot of times it's somewhere pretty accessible. It might be just a town that's 3 hours drive or something of that nature. And I think it lends and informs the recording because it gives the individual and feeds them a context that they're working on their art. They've come to Santa Cruz for 5 days to record is different than doing it down the street.
Yeah. If you feel different going for a walk on the beach, why wouldn't you sound different going for a walk on the beach?
Yep. It's true.
All right. So share with us a favorite hardware tool, something that when you have it on sessions and you're recording, it always seems to make things better.
Well, as far as hardware, again, I just come back to the fact that, if you can have a preamp there and the battery operated sound devices are great, that's great. And the 58s, for getting low end even, I found that they work so much better. There's not a lot of low end on a lot of the recordings I do because a lot of them are acoustic and solo and duo, but it can capture low end so much better than so many other better microphones. So
now, how does that compare to a 57 to you? You sort of appreciate the 58 for more low end over a 57?
Yeah, I do. In a sense, also that I'd say that they can be both great in that regard. The 57 being more directional. But.
Okay, now you talked about recording artists usually acoustically, and they're not in a studio environment or maybe even an electrified environment. How often do you get a chance to take a sound like that and bring it into a studio? I don't know, say like Chris Blackwell did with Bob Marley and bringing the reggae sound to the studio and getting a huge deep bass to it and all that. Do you ever desire to do that? And do you ever have experiences where you do that and it turns out to be great, or is it typically just not interesting to do?
Yeah. So in regards to that, I mean, again, there's no right or wrong way. I'm not anti anything, but for myself, I try to be invisible on the recordings. In fact, there are instances where I've added something here or there, and I hope that, and I'm almost certain that people could not figure out what I have or have not added, and that's what I desire. When someone collaborates in such a way that they really change the sound or become part of the sound, that for me is not of interest. But again, that's not to say that it's wrong. In general, this idea of someone coming in from a Western culture to play with someone from an underrepresented culture and then bringing a lot of Western values and sound to it, to me, kind of defeats the purpose to a large degree.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, Ian, share with us a favorite software tool, something that you really like that's in the computer.
Well, I mean, I think that for this kind of recording in particular, any noise reduction is going to be invaluable. And again, this is the thing about the digital era that is so incredible, is that to be able to do things today that we couldn't even do 2 years ago, let alone 5 years ago, and were impossible to do 20 or 30 years ago. So any of the noise reduction softwares are incredible. Isotope is incredible, or Waves. And, if you have the money, Cedars, but obviously that's something that's such a high end, but it's a miracle what can be done. And occasionally something that might otherwise be almost unsalvageable becomes so because of these resources. And I'm sure they're only going to become more plentiful in the coming months or years.
Sure. And if you work with a great mastering engineer, they probably have the high end stuff like the Cedar. And so you can take it that much further.
Yep. Exactly.
How about a resource for the business side? I know you've experienced the business side in a lot of different forms, whether an author or a concert promoter or a musician or a producer. Give us something that would help our listeners out, who are making records and using studios a lot.
Well, I mean, I think Polestar.com is such a great resource. It's about live recording, but I think it's a way of learning almost anecdotally about how the business works. Even though I'm not very concerned with the commercial aspects of the business, it can be very fascinating to see the changes. One of the big misconceptions that people have is that the music industry is dying, and the music industry is in fact a growth industry. They're making more money every year. It's pretty stable, but they're making more money every year. Mm-hmm. They're making more of it from live rather than recordings, and they're making it from fewer people, which is a sad trend. But it's a $1 billion business, and I think Polestar, reflecting the live music industry can be very revealing. I mean, for me to see that Madonna had the largest grossing tour in the world, I think it was year before last, was shocking. And of course, that does not mean that more people went to see her. That means that she's able to charge a lot more money for people to go see her and ends up making more money.
Interesting. And so Polestar is, I actually am not very familiar with it, but it's a website that it gives us insight into all these different aspects of the business.
Yeah, it's a website all about the live music industry, and they put out the sort of the equivalent of Billboard for the live music industry, but the website is really great. You'll find out about news there sometimes that you wouldn't find anywhere else, or find it out there sooner. And also you can find tour information for artists there by the city or by the artist.
Okay, cool.
That's usually up to date.
Okay, great tip. All right, so here comes the hypothetical question. And I think you definitely know the answer to this one because you experienced it, although it may not be what people's typical answers are. If you had to find yourself in a new, strange city, you needed a simple setup to start recording, you needed to find people to record, and this applies maybe a little bit more to somebody who's moving to a new place to live, but you needed to make ends meet so you could continue to record and do all that. Tell us what would you choose to use to record with? How would you find people, and how would you survive? And if you want to, you could really kind of spin this on your travels. So the survival could be, how do you live, eat, and do that when you're in these faraway places?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, knowing that you don't need so much equipment as much as people might believe, and that the relationships are going to be what's important, is something that, that can lead to maybe contacts and the ability. But, if you've got a Tascam 660 and you've got an EV RE20 and a lavalier can always come in handy, and a couple of 57s and 58s and an AKG 451 condenser mic, and ideally couple those, sound device preamps. But even without those, I think you can record just about anything quite well. And as far as meeting people and going about it and trying to make ends meet, I believe hugely in volunteering and giving people a sample. It's much better to be proactive and active than to sit back passively and wait for someone. I'd much rather go out there and just, agree to record somebody for free. Go out and find a band that you like, or somebody's busking on the street, and talk to them and record them, and then go from there and see what comes of it, and do it for the right reasons, and then hope that the finances will follow.
Yeah. Well, so now here's a question that I haven't asked anybody else yet, but when you're traveling, I know that a lot of times it's very important, just as important as what you bring is what you leave behind. Tell us some of the rules that you've learned from traveling about traveling light, bringing just enough. What are the things that people tend to bring with them that they don't need? For example, did you travel with a lot of cables and mic stands even?
Well, I've got these collapsible mic stands that work pretty well. So yeah, I do, but there have been instances where it's not possible. What I found is duct tape. Duct tape is about all you need. And if you've got duct tape, you'll find a place to put the mic. In most cases, there's going to be chairs around. You just tape it to a chair. If you're outside, you tape it to a tree. It's not ideal, but necessity is the mother of invention. There's usually a way to make it work. And also, I really believe in laying microphones on the ground, that you can get really good sound that way, particularly if you're talking about, specifically foot taps, or if you're talking about wanting to get more of a mono sound of a single solo performer. It can sound really great. That's the only place there's going to be any reflection when you're outdoors.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of what the PZM mics were designed for, right? Where you would just lay it down on the edge of a stage or on the ground, and it avoids the sound bouncing off the floor and up into the mic. Yep,
and those can be amazing. That's great. That's a great mic to have.
Very cool. All right. Well, so now here comes the big doozy of a question, which probably wasn't even on your cheat sheet. It's our closing question. And Ian, tell our listeners, what is the single most important thing that they can do to become a rock star of the recording studio themselves?
Tell the truth.
Excellent. And what does that mean?
Well, it means have integrity, be direct with people, but also in the music itself, try to find the truth of the experience. And again, there's no right or wrong way to do things, but I think that when people share a genuine experience, people value that almost more than anything else. I think, people are starved for attention. We know that the internet is kind of fueled by that, but people are also starved for honesty. People that are very nice and social and try too hard and are ultimately are maybe being artificial and false, sometimes have less success socially than people that can be quite blunt. And I think we should be empathic with people and sensitive and care, but at the same time, it's amazing how a bit of candor can go so far with people, because it does eliminate fear ultimately. They realize, I'm with somebody who's going to tell me the truth, and I don't have to second guess and doubt, and I can kind of take it or leave it. But if I choose to interact with that person, I kind of know that probably they're going to let me know, where I'm going wrong, or let me know when something's good, and know that it means something.
Yeah, I like it. I've got a term for your next music fundraiser. It's called candor, not pander.
That's a good one.
Nice. Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. Thanks for giving us so much of your time. I'm not even sure how long we've been going, but I'm sure it's a long one. I just felt like there was so much great stuff to talk about. And again, I still feel like we just completely cut you short. We could go on and on all day. So maybe we'll just have to have you back on the show later on and we can talk more about, studio stuff or whatever you want.
That'd be nice. And thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you. And Rockstars, I want to remind you that I will include links to all the stuff we talk about in the show notes. Ian, before I sign off, can you let our listeners know how they can find you and reach out to you and learn more about you?
Yeah, if you go to, search for ianbrennan.com or Ian Brennan, you'll find me. I'm pretty easy to find.
Okay, groovy. And Rockstars, of course, I will include links to all the stuff we're talking about in the show notes. Just go to rsrockstars.com, search Ian, and it'll take you right to the blog post. I'll include YouTube videos of the stuff Ian's worked on and links to music and records so you can go check them out. And if you're on your podcast app on the iPhone, you should be able to just click through, just touch the logo there for Recording Studio Rockstars, and it'll just open up or unzip the show notes for you. You can click right through. So thanks very much for listening. Ian, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you around the studio, or we'll see you out somewhere else.
Yeah, outdoors probably.
Outdoors, right on. Cheers, thanks so much. Talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.